What Rob Reiner's daughter Romy just revealed did not arrive as a loud press conference or a carefully staged interview. It came quietly, almost reluctantly, through a conversation that felt more like a confession than a headline. For decades, Rob Reiner has been known as one of Hollywood's most powerful storytellers, the director behind films that defined generations, the man whose voice carried moral certainty, humor, and conviction. To the public, he was consistent, outspoken, and seemingly unshakable. But Romy Reiner's recent words suggest that behind the confidence, behind the political statements and creative authority, there existed a private world far more fragile, conflicted, and painful than anyone imagined. Romy did not begin by attacking her father. In fact, her tone was measured, careful, almost protective. That is what made the revelation so unsettling. She spoke of growing up in a house where conversations were intense, where ideals were strong, but where emotional presence was often missing. She described a father who was physically there but emotionally absorbed elsewhere, consumed by work, by public battles, by the weight of being Rob Reiner. To many, that might sound familiar, even ordinary for a Hollywood family. But Romy framed it differently. She suggested that the gap was not accidental. It was structural, built into the identity her father had constructed for himself. According to Romy, her father's public certainty did not translate into private safety. She recalled moments when disagreement was not welcome, when questioning the family narrative felt like betrayal rather than curiosity. In her words, there was a sense that love was present, but conditional, shaped by alignment, approval, and silence. She did not accuse him of cruelty. Instead, she described something colder and perhaps more damaging, emotional distance wrapped in righteousness. A belief that being right in the world justified being absent at home. What shocked listeners most was not any single anecdote, but the pattern she outlined. Romy suggested that her father's identity as a moral authority became a shield, something that prevented vulnerability. When conflicts arose within the family, they were often reframed as misunderstandings, brushed aside rather than addressed. Pain was intellectualized, not felt. She spoke of learning early how to be articulate about emotions without ever feeling truly heard. In a household famous for storytelling, the hardest stories were never told. Romy also touched on the pressure of legacy. Being Rob Reiner's daughter meant inheriting not just opportunity, but expectation. She described feeling as though her role was to protect the image, to avoid saying anything that might complicate the public version of her father. For years, she complied. Silence became a form of loyalty. But as she grew older, that silence began to feel like erasure. She implied that speaking now was less about exposing him and more about reclaiming herself. Perhaps the most startling moment came when Romy suggested that her father may not fully understand the emotional cost of his absence. She hinted that attempts to discuss it were often met with defensiveness or intellectual debate, rather than empathy. It was not that he refused to listen, but that he listened as a thinker, not as a parent. To the outside world, Rob Reiner is a man who champions compassion and justice. To his daughter, he was often a man who struggled to sit quietly with discomfort. This revelation has unsettled many fans because it challenges a deeply held assumption. We like to believe that those who speak eloquently about values must live them effortlessly at home. Romy's words complicate that belief. They suggest that moral clarity in public life does not guarantee emotional availability in private life. In fact, sometimes the louder the public voice, the quieter the domestic one becomes. Importantly, Romy did not frame her story as a condemnation. She acknowledged her father's achievements, his intelligence, his intentions. But she also made clear that intention does not erase impact. Love, she implied, is not measured by beliefs or statements, but by presence. And presence, in her experience, was inconsistent. As her words continue to circulate, they invite a broader question, not just about Rob Reiner, but about power, identity, and family in Hollywood. How many children grow up in the shadow of a public figure whose values are celebrated, while their private needs go unmet? How often does certainty replace curiosity, and principle replace listening? Romy Reiner's revelation does not destroy her father's legacy, but it fractures the surface, revealing the human cost beneath the icon. And in that fracture, something uncomfortable emerges. The realization that even the best storytellers can struggle to hear the people closest to them. If you want me to continue with part 2, 800 words, deepening the fallout, public reaction, and the unspoken consequences of Romy's confession, just tell me to continue. The impact of Romy Reiner's revelation did not explode immediately. There was no instant backlash, no frantic denials, no dramatic counterstatements. Instead, something quieter happened, and perhaps something more unsettling. A pause. In that pause, audiences, colleagues, and longtime admirers of Rob Reiner began to re-examine memories they thought they understood. His interviews, his speeches, his moral certainty suddenly carried a different resonance, not false, but incomplete. Within Hollywood circles, the reaction was cautious. Friends of the family described Rob as generous, principled, deeply committed to his beliefs. None of that was challenged directly by Romy's words. What changed was the frame. Her account suggested that the same intensity that fueled his public convictions may have crowded out the softer skills required in private life. Listening without correcting. Sitting with discomfort without reframing it. Being present without needing to lead. For many parents in positions of power, this struck a nerve. Romy's story was not about scandal. It was about emotional absence disguised as responsibility. She described a home where discussions were articulate, intelligent, even passionate, yet somehow left her feeling unseen. The contradiction unsettled listeners because it felt familiar. How many families live inside that same paradox, where values are spoken fluently but practiced unevenly? Public reaction followed a predictable arc. Supporters rushed to contextualize. They spoke about generational differences, about the pressures of fame, about the difficulty of balancing public life and family. Critics, meanwhile, seized on the irony. How could a man so vocal about empathy fail to provide it consistently to his own child? But Romy herself resisted both extremes. She did not ask for condemnation, and she did not offer absolution. She simply stayed with the truth as she experienced it. What made her words linger was their restraint. She did not accuse her father of intentional harm. Instead, she pointed to a pattern of emotional deflection. Problems were discussed, not felt. Pain was analyzed, not held. In her telling, the household functioned like a think tank rather than a refuge. That distinction mattered. It suggested that intelligence, when unaccompanied by emotional availability, can become isolating rather than empowering. Observers also noted what Romy did not say. She did not claim estrangement. She did not speak of hatred or resentment. What she expressed was something quieter and arguably more painful, grief for a version of connection that never fully materialized. She spoke as someone still negotiating love, still hoping for understanding, but no longer willing to protect the image at the expense of her own voice. As the story circulated, it prompted uncomfortable self-reflection across Hollywood. Directors, actors, and public figures who have built careers on strong moral identities found themselves asking private questions. Where does conviction end and rigidity begin? When does leadership become distance? And how often do children learn to stay silent not because they are unheard, but because they sense that speaking would disrupt the story everyone else depends on? Rob Reiner himself remained publicly silent. That silence became part of the narrative. Some interpreted it as dignity. Others as avoidance. But within the context of Romy's account, it took on another meaning. Silence, after all, was one of the dynamics she described. Not the absence of words, but the absence of emotional response. In the end, what Romy revealed was not a secret so much as a fracture. A gap between intention and impact, between public virtue and private presence. Her words did not rewrite her father's legacy, but they added a chapter that cannot be ignored. They reminded audiences that no amount of public righteousness exempts anyone from the basic work of listening at home. And perhaps that is why her revelation feels so unsettling. Because it does not belong only to Rob Reiner. It belongs to every family shaped by power, principle, and the quiet cost of being emotionally unattended. As the conversation around Romy Reiner's words deepened, the focus slowly shifted from reaction to reflection. What lingered was no longer the shock of what she revealed, but the weight of what it implied about legacy. Rob Reiner's career has always been framed as purposeful, moral, and intentional. His films argue for decency, empathy, and human connection. Yet Romy's account introduced a quieter contradiction, one that does not negate his work, but complicates its meaning. It raised a difficult question. What happens when the values we project into the world are not fully embodied in the spaces that matter most? Legacy, Romy suggested indirectly, is not only what survives in archives and awards. It is also what lives on in the emotional memory of children. She spoke as someone who had inherited both privilege and absence, opportunity and distance. In doing so, she reframed success not as something that shelters a family, but as something that can unintentionally overshadow it. The more visible the mission became, the less room there seemed to be for uncertainty, vulnerability, and unresolved feeling. What made this phase of the story especially poignant was the absence of resolution. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no televised conversation, no neatly packaged moment of understanding. Romy did not claim that speaking out had healed the divide. She implied instead that truth does not always repair, but it clarifies. And clarity, while painful, can be a form of freedom. By naming what was missing, she stopped carrying it alone. For Rob Reiner, the silence continued. To some, that silence felt heavy with meaning. Was it reflection? Was it resistance? Or was it simply the familiar posture of a man more comfortable shaping narratives than responding to them? In Romy's telling, this pattern had existed for years. Difficult emotions were acknowledged intellectually, then gently set aside. What could not be resolved through reason was often postponed indefinitely. Observers began to wonder whether reconciliation, if it ever comes, would look different from what the public expects. Not an apology framed as a statement, not a defense of intentions, but a willingness to sit in discomfort without correcting it. Romy's story suggested that what she wanted was not agreement, but presence. Not acknowledgement of facts, but recognition of feeling. The broader cultural response evolved as well. Parents wrote about seeing themselves in Rob Reiner's blind spots. Children of high achievers shared stories of growing up admired but unheard. The narrative expanded beyond one family, becoming a mirror held up to a culture that rewards conviction more than curiosity, productivity more than attentiveness. In that sense, Romy's revelation resonated less as celebrity drama and more as a generational reckoning. There is also the question of timing. Why now? Romy did not explicitly answer it, but her tone suggested readiness rather than anger. Speaking later in life often carries a different purpose. It is less about accusation and more about integration. She appeared to be stitching together her own story, no longer willing to leave certain chapters blank simply to preserve someone else's coherence. In the end, the most unsettling aspect of her revelation may be its restraint. She did not tear down her father's image. She humanized it. And in doing so, she reminded the audience that heroes are often built from fragments, some luminous, some unresolved. Rob Reiner remains a man of influence and conviction. But through his daughter's voice, he also becomes something else. A father still learning how to listen. Whether that listening will happen remains unknown. But Romy Reiner has already shifted the story. She has moved it away from certainty and toward complexity. And sometimes, complexity is the most honest legacy of all. After the words were spoken and the reactions settled, what remained was the quiet aftermath. This was not the kind of story that burns brightly and disappears. It lingered, precisely because it did not offer spectacle. Romy Reiner's revelation continued to echo in subtler ways, in how people reread the past and reconsidered the cost of emotional restraint. The most profound consequences unfolded not in headlines, but but in the private spaces where families resemble one another more than they admit. For Romy, telling the truth did not bring closure. It brought exposure. She had stepped out of the protective shadow that had shaped her life and accepted the risk that comes with visibility. There is a particular vulnerability in speaking honestly about a parent who is admired by the world. Every sentence carries the weight of loyalty and betrayal at once. Her decision suggested that remaining silent had become heavier than the consequences of speaking. Psychologists and cultural commentators began to frame her story in terms of emotional inheritance. Children do not only inherit values and opportunities. They inherit coping mechanisms. They learn what is discussable and what must remain internal. In Romy's case, the lesson appeared to be that articulation could replace intimacy, that clarity of thought could substitute for closeness. It is a sophisticated survival skill, but one that often leaves an emotional deficit later in life. Romy Reiner's generation was shaped by conviction. They believed in standing for something, speaking clearly, choosing sides. That clarity built careers and movements. But Romy's account suggested that such clarity, when applied rigidly within a family, can limit emotional range. When everything must make sense, there is little room for feelings that do not resolve cleanly. Sadness without a solution. Anger without a conclusion. Longing without a demand. The long-term consequence of that environment, Romy implied, was a sense of self that developed carefully, but cautiously. She learned how to be thoughtful, articulate, and composed. What she struggled with was the feeling of being emotionally met. This is not a dramatic wound. It does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly, shaping relationships, expectations, and the way one asks for care. As weeks passed, the absence of a public response from Romy Reiner became less conspicuous and more symbolic. Silence, in this context, was no longer neutral. It reflected the very dynamic Romy had described. Not hostility, not denial, but distance. For some observers, that silence confirmed her account more powerfully than any rebuttal could have. For others, it remained ambiguous. Silence can mean many things. Reflection, fatigue, uncertainty. But ambiguity itself was part of the story. The cultural conversation broadened further. Romy's revelation arrived at a moment when many adult children are reassessing their upbringing with language their parents never had. Emotional intelligence, once dismissed as softness, is now recognized as essential. Her story fit into a larger shift, where success is no longer measured solely by output, but by presence. By who was there, and how. There was also an unspoken sadness threaded through the discussion. The recognition that understanding often arrives too late. That parents and children may love each other deeply, yet miss each other entirely. Romy did not claim that her father was incapable of growth. She suggested instead that growth requires a willingness to sit with discomfort without reshaping it. A skill that even great storytellers must learn. In the end, the lasting impact of Romy Reiner's words may not be what they revealed about her father, but what they revealed about silence itself. Silence can protect, but it can also preserve distance. Breaking it does not guarantee healing, but it does reclaim agency. Romy chose clarity over comfort. And in doing so, she altered the emotional landscape of a story that was never only hers to carry. The question that followed Romy Reiner's revelation was not whether reconciliation was possible, but whether it was even the right word. Reconciliation suggests a return, a closing of distance, a restoration of something once intact. Romy's story implied that what was missing had never fully existed in the first place. What remained was not a broken bond, but an incomplete one. And incompleteness does not resolve itself through apology alone. In the weeks after her words circulated, observers began to speak less about blame and more about repair. Repair is quieter. It does not demand public gestures or symbolic statements. It requires repetition, patience, and the humility to accept that understanding may come slowly, if at all. Romy did not suggest that her father owed her a performance of remorse. What she implied was far more challenging. A willingness to change the way he listens. Healing, in this context, would not mean agreement. Romy never asked her father to see the world as she does. She asked, implicitly, to be seen as she is. That distinction matters. Many parents believe that love is demonstrated through guidance, correction, and explanation. Romy's account suggested that love, as experienced by the child, is often demonstrated through presence without instruction. Through attention without agenda. Rob Reiner's silence continued to shape interpretation. Some close to him hinted privately that the words had landed more deeply than anyone realized. That he was reflecting, not retreating. Whether that reflection will translate into action remains unknown. But reflection alone does not bridge emotional distance. It must eventually move outward, toward engagement that risks discomfort. There is also the matter of time. Decades of patterned behavior do not unravel quickly. Romy's courage in speaking did not reset history. It acknowledged it. And acknowledgement, while powerful, does not immediately alter emotional reflexes formed over a lifetime. Reconciliation, if it comes, would likely arrive not as a single moment, but as a series of small, unremarkable shifts. A conversation that does not end with resolution. A disagreement that does not require victory. A silence that is shared rather than imposed. For Romy, healing may not depend on her father's response at all. There is a subtle strength in her revelation. By naming her experience, she reclaimed authorship of her own emotional narrative. She no longer needed validation to know that what she felt was real. That autonomy is often the first step toward peace, regardless of outcome. The story also invites a more uncomfortable reflection about generational inheritance. Many parents, especially those shaped by eras of ideological struggle, learn to equate strength with certainty. Vulnerability was seen as indulgent, emotional openness as inefficient. Romy's words suggested that such lessons, while adaptive in public life, can become limiting in private ones. The world rewards conviction. Families often require curiosity. What remains unresolved is not a feud, but a possibility. The possibility that listening might still happen. That a father known for shaping narratives might learn to receive one he did not write. That a daughter who grew up learning how to speak carefully might finally be heard without being analyzed. Romy Reiner did not promise a hopeful ending. She offered something more honest. An opening. An invitation to sit with complexity rather than rush toward resolution. In doing so, she reframed healing not as an outcome, but as a practice. And perhaps that is the quiet truth beneath the shock. Not every story concludes with reconciliation. Some conclude with recognition. With the understanding that love and distance can coexist, and that speaking the truth, even late, can still change the shape of what remains. By the time the story reached this stage, it had moved beyond revelation and reaction into something more enduring. Legacy. Not the kind etched into film history or cultural commentary, but the quieter legacy that lives in the emotional memory of those closest to us. Romy Reiner's words lingered because they challenged a comforting illusion. The idea that a meaningful public life automatically translates into a meaningful private one. Rob Reiner's legacy has always been framed in terms of influence. His films shaped conversations. His voice carried authority. His convictions were clear and unwavering. Yet through Romy's account, another legacy emerged, one that was never intended, but deeply felt. A legacy of emotional distance that did not arise from cruelty or neglect, but from prioritization. From a life structured around purpose rather than presence. What makes this legacy so difficult to confront is that it exists alongside genuine love. Romy never denied that her father cared. She suggested instead that care, when filtered through certainty and identity, can become abstract. It exists as principle rather than practice. And children, no matter how articulate or mature, experience love most clearly through attunement, not intention. As the narrative settled, many began to see this story less as a personal indictment and more as a cautionary mirror. especially for those who build identities around being right, being vocal, being impactful. There is a subtle danger in believing that moral clarity excuses emotional absence. That fighting for the world absolves one from tending to the inner lives of those at home. Romy's revelation also reframed the concept of bravery. In Hollywood, bravery is often associated with risk-taking in art or politics. But her bravery was domestic, inward-facing. She risked misunderstanding. She risked being labeled ungrateful or disloyal. She risked being reduced to a headline rather than heard as a human being. That choice carries a different kind of courage, one that does not seek applause. What remains unanswered is whether Rob Reiner will ever publicly respond, and whether such a response would matter. Words, after all, are his domain. Romy's story suggested that what she longed for was not articulation, but presence. Not a statement, but a shift. Whether that shift will occur privately is something the public may never know. And perhaps that is as it should be. Some reckonings are not meant for an audience. The lasting emotional resonance of this story lies in its refusal to simplify. There is no villain. No hero. Only people shaped by their era, their beliefs, and their limitations. A father who gave the world clarity, and a daughter who learned to live with ambiguity. A family bound by love, yet separated by emotional language they never fully shared. In the end, Romy Reiner did not shock the world by revealing a scandal. She unsettled it by revealing a truth that many recognize but rarely articulate. That emotional presence is not guaranteed by success, intelligence, or virtue. It must be practiced, deliberately and repeatedly. And when it is missing, its absence echoes far longer than any public achievement. Her words leave the story open. Not unresolved, but unfinished. An ending that does not close the door, but leaves it ajar. A reminder that listening is not a talent reserved for artists or leaders. It is a discipline. One that must be learned, often late, and sometimes at great emotional cost. In the final reckoning, what Romy Reiner revealed was not a conclusion, but a reckoning with time. Time spent speaking instead of listening. Time invested in shaping the world rather than sitting quietly inside a family. And time that cannot be recovered, only understood. Her words did not arrive as a demand for justice or repair. They arrived as a recognition that emotional truth, once named, changes the past not by rewriting it, but by illuminating it. For Rob Reiner, the story now carries a dual inheritance. On one side, a towering public legacy defined by films, convictions, and cultural impact. On the other, a private legacy defined by moments that did not happen, conversations that stayed intellectual, emotions that were acknowledged but never fully held. Neither cancels the other. They coexist, uneasily, like two versions of the same life viewed from different distances. What makes this ending resonate is its restraint. There is no final confrontation, no dramatic reconciliation scene that satisfies an audience trained to expect closure. Instead, there is a quiet acceptance that some truths surface late, when the shape of a relationship is already formed. Romy's courage was not in changing her father, but in changing her relationship to silence. She chose not to carry what could finally be named. In doing so, she offered the audience something rare. Not a scandal to consume, but a mirror to sit with. Many who followed the story recognized themselves not in Rob Reiner's fame, but in his blind spots. In the way conviction can harden into certainty. In the way being right can become a substitute for being present. In the way love can exist sincerely, yet still fail to meet emotional need. The enduring takeaway is not about celebrity or generational conflict. It is about attention. About how easily attention drifts toward purpose, identity, and achievement, while the quieter work of emotional presence is postponed. Romy's story suggests that this postponement is rarely intentional, but it is deeply consequential. Children adapt. They grow articulate. They learn to explain themselves. But explanation is not the same as being received. If reconciliation ever comes, it may arrive without witnesses. It may arrive as a different kind of listening, practiced imperfectly and without announcement. Or it may not arrive at all. The story does not promise redemption. It promises honesty. And honesty, while less comforting, is often more transformative. What lingers most powerfully is the simplicity of the lesson beneath the complexity. That emotional presence cannot be delegated to belief systems, achievements, or moral clarity. It is built moment by moment, through attention that does not correct, explain, or defend. Through listening that does not seek resolution. Through the willingness to be shaped by what is heard. Romy Reiner's revelation will eventually fade from headlines. But its emotional truth will remain, precisely because it does not belong to one family alone. It belongs to every relationship where love was present, yet somehow not felt. To every parent who assumed intention was enough. And to every child who learned to speak carefully because being fully heard felt uncertain. In the end, the shock was never about what she said. It was about what her words exposed. The quiet cost of emotional absence. The fragility beneath public certainty. And the reminder that the most important stories are not the ones we tell the world, but the ones we are willing to listen to at home.